Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Latin American Politics. I hope that you're doing well and that you had a nice weekend. We're going to get started today and have an excellent discussion that incorporates the role of the United States. For the first time, we're actually going to really take on the question of the role of the United States in Latin America, and we'll have a set of debates and discussions about whether the US is a force for good or not. And this will involve talking about democracy. It'll involve talking about markets and liberalism and the promotion of new ideas. And it'll get us talking about the impact of the US in Latin America and whether we view that positively or negatively. And so I'm very excited to get started because this is a discussion that I know many of us have been waiting to have. And I know that it's especially relevant for us because we're in the United States and these relationships with Latin America persist to this day. And so sit back, and I hope that you feel comfortable and ready to engage. I will do a little bit of lecturing as always, but I'm going to incorporate your input as much as possible. And I look forward also to creating some groups that will let us discuss these issues together before we get back as a class and talk about these things on a broader level. Now, I am recording the lecture, and as a reminder, you can access all of this material through CAT courses. I upload this stuff immediately, and the YouTube videos have been getting a lot of traffic. The Latin American politics videos have been getting the most traffic, and so not only does your class have the best attendance, but you also have what appears to be the most sustained interest in the course, and I'm just so thrilled about that because I love it too. So I am recording this lecture, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll do my best from time to time to incorporate some cat content. We have a kitten here of 4 months, and we also have an older cat, both of whom 6 years old. My partner is adding the information for me as I blank on it. But this is Katie. This is Katie, and this is Allison, also a
Hi.
cat. But we love these cats so much, and they help us get through the day. And we're so happy that they join us. Today, for example, Bernie spent almost all of the time I spent writing this lecture with me on my desk. And so we'll see him from time to time. But above all, we're going to have a great discussion and talk about Latin America and the United States. And the vantage point for this, as you know, is early 20th century politics, which is the period of time that we're picking up on now after dealing with the period of state development. There's a lot of information in the chat, and I'm going to take a look really quickly and see if I'm addressing everything. Yes, Aditya, we can talk after class. Yes, we have these wonderful cats. Yes, Francisco, you must get a cat, especially during COVID. It's just so therapeutic, and they need homes too, so anything you can do to make the world a better place often begins with a cat, and in our case we've got two of them. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, before I get started, one more thing. I wanted to let you know that I plan to send out a review guide for the first exam. I'm going to try to send it by tomorrow. But the review guide will be very straightforward, but it should give you a sense of what the exam will look like. As a reminder, the exam will involve concepts and definitions and then a longer essay question. But I don't intend to take you by surprise. It should be very straightforward, but I do anticipate and hope that you'll demonstrate knowledge from the reading as well as from the lecture and from the course content. So with all of these announcements now being made, let's go ahead and get started and start our discussion about the United States and Latin America through the vantage point of early 20th century politics. And so we're going to begin with the export economy, because the export economy is how we connect to the role of the US and some of the efforts to promote certain arrangements made by the US. The export economy, as you'll recall, was this transformation in Latin America. Latin America became a very large export market, principally natural resources, but also things like cattle and beef and wool. If you were in Chile, it was copper. If you were in Argentina, it was beef or wool. If you were in Peru, it might have been silver, and so on and so forth. But the political significance of this export economy cannot be understated. Remember those caudillos that we talked about, those military strongmen who were so important? during the early post-independence period, these caudillos were dealt a fatal blow by the role of the export economy, because the export economy created a set of interests who promoted liberal reforms and promoted the creation of national integration on the level of the creation of markets and the solidification of political institutions that could help to represent the interests of the hacienda owners. Now, these hacienda owners were very, very much in support of law and order, and the delivery of goods was their primary objective. They wanted to access markets and they wanted to make profits. And so they promoted the idea of national integration, at least in terms of the creation of systems of law and order and maybe the national military and so on. This took the form of railroads and roads and telephone lines. It meant that export taxes were used to generate revenues for the creation of stronger infrastructure, a military force that could help to promote the interests of the nation at large. And so this image here on the right is of Buenos Aires, which gives you a sense of what it looked like, the economic activity and the export economy, connected as it was to ports and to markets throughout the world, connected by water. This was a period where the interests in Latin America began to really solidify around these large hacienda owners against the preservation of these caudillos and these local military strongmen. This is Mexico City at that period of state development and the sort of emergence of the export economy. This is the late 1800s in Mexico City. Kind of gives you a sense of what life looked like at that time. Again, we're talking about the emergence of this sort of larger market and the kind of solidification of the export economy around natural resources and agricultural products. Mexico was like Argentina. It was an early developer and it grew into a large export market. And like in Argentina, in Mexico, there was this emergence of these hacienda owners who kind of displaced those caudillos and those military strongmen that characterized the early post-independence period. But the truth is, the export economy didn't have the impact that we may have hoped for in terms of the formation of a national consciousness. If we're thinking of a nation as a grouping of people who share a political identity, this search for the nation proved to still be quite difficult, despite these advances in the formation of the export economy. The search for the nation was quite elusive in Mexico and Argentina and elsewhere. Now, it is true that the stability that was characterized by this export economy, or that characterized this export economy, it did give rise to liberal thought, and it sort of underscored and helped to support the idea that we could displace tradition and religious values and focus on science and empirical knowledge in the pursuit of economic gains. Now, this ideology we associate with what was called and is still called positivism. Now, positivism focused on science and empiricism and moved away from tradition and religion. And the idea was that government should be guided by the promotion of markets and liberal values and democracy. Democracy for some, not for all, as we'll see shortly. But the key is that positivism gave force to placing elites in front and permitting the exclusion of the lower classes. And so from the get-go, I want to stress to you that the search for the nation proved elusive in the first place because of the role of elites in kind of creating a place for themselves at the front of the line and kind of displacing and marginalizing the masses, including the indigenous, women, basically anyone who wasn't white and a male, and anyone who didn't own property. And so that would include myself. I'm not a property owner. My point is, this was an elite-centered system. And so the search for the nation from the beginning didn't include those various other groups who we know were such important groups in Latin America then and still today. Now, positivism went hand in hand with blaming the caudillos and the indigenous for all the ills of the country. And in Argentina and Mexico and Peru and Uruguay, essentially wherever you looked, liberals blamed those traditional actors. Is traditional meaning those actors who were there before the liberals were there. The liberals blamed them for all the problems of the country. And a good example is actually President Sarmiento, Domingo Sarmiento of Argentina between 1863 and 74, who wrote Civilization and Barbarism in 1845. And in this book, he absolutely attacked Juan Manuel de Rosas. Remember Juan Manuel de Rosas? He was that military strongman, that national caudillo in Argentina who rose to great fame and stardom. He was torn a new one by Sarmiento, who called him retrograde and backwards and in bad for the country. And it wasn't just Sarmiento, it was elites like him and liberals like him in Argentina and elsewhere who really kind of cornered these traditional actors and treated them as the source of all ills in their countries. Now, it wasn't just that he scorned and attacked the indigenous and the caudillos and some of those traditional actors. He also treated the people of Buenos Aires as enlightened due to their dignity and their contact with Europe. Now, remember that Buenos Aires from the beginning was an international city, and it was not just a place connected to international markets, but also a place with, large populations from various countries of the world, not just Spain, but it was also Italy and other places like that. And so Buenos Aires had these connections to Europe that for Sarmiento were absolutely essential to kind of escaping from barbarism and kind of dignifying Argentina and so on and so forth. These ideas of positivism and liberalism went hand in hand. And before we continue, I want to pause and stress to you that liberalism has a variety of meanings. We have small L liberalism that we often associate with the political left. And then there's also big L liberalism, which really is closer to what we might think of as sort of conservatism of the present day, which is a more traditional sort of embrace of markets and elites and those sort of wealthy or noble classes who might be viewed as more capable of making decisions, but who themselves were not part of the royalty or the nobility. This is the liberalism that we're talking about when we talk about Latin America and positivism. We're talking about a liberalism that promoted elites and really kind of subjugated and opposed and put in second class caudillos and the indigenous and of course women and blacks and mestizos, anyone who wasn't a white landowner and a male. This is the situation that we find ourselves in at this period of the rise of the export economy in the early 1900s in Latin America. Now, what's true is that liberalism went hand in hand with the sort of solidification of democratic institutions. But remember that it was democracy for some, not for all. And in Latin America, as elsewhere, these democratic institutions involved very limited participation for women who were denied the right to vote, indigenous, and essentially anyone else, again, who didn't own land and who wasn't white, and who wasn't a male. So women were denied the right to vote. Indigenous, they struggled to gain their own citizenship, and literacy and income requirements denied suffrage to peasants, to people in the countryside who weren't lucky enough to own their own land, but who maybe relied on subsistence or some kind of sharecropping. There was a clear distinction made between the elites and the able from the point of view of liberalism and everyone else. And again, I want to stress to you that everyone else was really the majority of the population. The fact is, these democratic institutions gained a foothold for some, but for the vast majority, it did not have an impact for them. And in fact, they found themselves on the outside looking in. And so in Buenos Aires, as pictured here, those who were in politics and who benefited from democratic institutions often lived in places like this. These enormous haciendas are these places that seem to bring together all the wealth and the splendor enjoyed by those elites who promoted these liberal ideas. And so from the get-go, we've got markets, we've got democratic institutions, but in both cases, we have limits on the participation of women and indigenous and blacks and mixed race people and former slaves and so on, and peasants as well, right? So I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward, who was in and who was out in terms of who could benefit from the markets and the institutions that were brought about by the liberal period that coincided with this sort of early 1900s through 1930s period that we're discussing today. So in terms of those democratic institutions that did emerge, we did see competitive party systems for men. The rise of these party systems often involved three types of parties, and most countries saw essentially the same kind of formation. In the first place, we had a conservative party where traditional agricultural classes in the church were well represented and had their interests promoted quite robustly by parties in politics of a conservative bent. We had liberal parties that represented business interests and middle classes who had some capacity to participate in politics or who benefited in some way, but maybe not much more than peasants or indigenous who found themselves on the outside. And then we had socialist parties who promoted the interests of the working classes and peasants. And in country after country, you saw the formation of these types of parties. And in places like Uruguay, for example, socialist parties not only represented working classes and peasants, but also promoted the cause of enfranchising women and suffrage for women. And so you see here, La mujer uruguaya no tiene derechos. Uruguayan women don't have rights. And they're comparing this to the experience in the United States, where women also don't have rights at this time. In Africa, where the countries remained colonized and they had no rights whatsoever. Some places in Asia and Europe, women did have rights. And so women in Uruguay compared their situation to that of women in Europe, in Africa, in North America, and everywhere else out in the world. And the reason I like this little image here is because it both gives you a sense of the causes taken up by socialist parties, and it also gives you a sense of the sort of awareness that women had in Uruguay in particular about their situation and their exclusion from politics. And so just because women weren't involved in politics didn't mean that they didn't recognize that they were excluded and that they had no rights. They absolutely recognized this. And from an early period, were fighting to promote their rights, mainly under the banner of socialist parties, because again, the conservatives and the liberals primarily represented those who already benefited from the system as it was. And so the institutions of this export and liberal period were sort of procedurally democratic, but very limited in their enfranchisement of different groups and in their promotion of the interests of different groups. What we see a kind of change that was limited in just how far it reached in the incorporation of the various groups in Latin American countries. Latin America is incredibly diverse in the differences in income and race and historical experience. This period didn't necessarily enfranchise or incorporate all people equally. And so what we need to understand as we set out on this discussion is that it was democracy for some, but not all. And in fact, most people didn't benefit from democracy. I'm going to check the chat really quickly. What is the name of your cat? Cadence is the big one, and Bernie is the small one. How many questions? I don't know what you're asking, Edzuri. Can you clarify that? I'm sorry. Quinn says there seems to be a correlation to the Southern Hemisphere in the voting rights photo, or at least the Southern continents for the most part. Absolutely. Those countries in Latin America sort of universally didn't extend the right to vote to women. And so they all kind of had a similar setup. And in this discussion, we're sort of treating those countries as essentially the same, although there could have been some differences from country to country that we're not picking up on in this presentation. But for all intents and purposes, Latin American democracy in its first guise did not represent the interests of women or indigenous or blacks or non-property holding white men, or really anyone else outside of property holding white men for that matter. Now, these parties, they had their problems. None of them were really strong enough to check the impulses of what were really semi-authoritarian presidents who often ruled by suppressing competition or abusing their executive power. And so, for example, conservative parties became irrelevant very quickly because their base was very narrow. The truth is, it's only a fraction of society who owns land, right? It's only a fraction of society who's white and male and in possession of land in the countryside. And so if you're only representing those interests, electorally speaking, you're going to become very antiquated very quickly. And they did. That was exactly what happened. Socialists, they often promoted these causes, but unrealistically so. And because it was very difficult to bring about redistribution and the egalitarianism they promoted, they often were not successful when in power when they sought to promote those causes. These are very difficult things to do. Redistribution is terrifically challenging. It's most of what I study in my own work. And let me tell you that even today, it's not easy to do. And in most cases, redistributive efforts fail precisely because of how much political support you have to mobilize from those who already benefit from the existing state of affairs. Now, liberal parties also had their problems. They alienated rural voters. The issue here was that the liberals really were quite positivist. Remember that positivist idea system that I just discussed that focused on putting elites in charge and kind of subjugating and kind of subordinating rural people? This is very alienating for those rural voters. And so liberal parties had a difficult time building new bases of support, as did conservative parties. And because all of these parties struggled to really be as competitive as they could be, presidents became quite powerful and were often able to rule as authoritarians within what were putatively democratic institutions. And so this is something that I want you to keep in mind as we go forward, because Latin America, probably more than any region in the world, has a legacy of powerful, powerful executives. The systems are set up not just to give presidents quite a great deal of power. It's also the case that the weakness of these political parties still today creates voids that presidents can easily fill and kind of rule in an authoritarian manner within. And this is often what we see. And so this book here about the history of political parties in 20th century Latin America, it's largely a history about the weaknesses of many parties and the challenges faced by many party systems, and how those challenges created a basis for semi-authoritarian rule. This is a theme that will appear over and over in Latin American politics in this class. It's not just something that happened during this narrow period in time. What we see today very much resembles what we saw then. And though many groups have been more enfranchised, comparatively speaking, there were quite a few limits still today that are worth discussing, especially when it comes, for example, to indigenous people and their representation in politics. But the presidents and the power wielded by presidents is a part of this story that we'll continue to discuss and that will unravel further and further and further. Now, we find ourselves at the question of the role of the United States. The United States is the focus of the reading that we did for today. And the United States is an important actor in Latin American politics for so many reasons. And before we get started, I'm going to split you up into groups, and I want you to discuss the following questions. What was the United States' main priority in Latin America at this time? And was the United States a force for good in Latin America? And I want you to think about why or why not. Now, don't worry about reproducing the same ideas from the reading or getting everything perfect. In fact, what I'm more interested in is your perception and your understanding of the situation, the understanding that you bring to the class. I'm well aware that the vast majority of us, if not all of us, have some interest maybe in Latin American politics, and we may have some ideas already about the role of the US. I want to hear from you, and I want you to bring your insight into this discussion. Now, do consider the reading to the extent that you can, but I don't want it to be disqualifying for you if you feel as though your insights mainly come from what you already know. I want us to discuss what we already know and bring our knowledge to the discussion so that we can learn from each other as much as possible. In previous discussions in class, we've learned so much from individual students, and I want to continue to do that. And so I am going to put you in groups again. I hope that this is fun for you and useful for you, but we will take about 5-10 minutes, and I will consider coming to individual groups and maybe discussing some of your ideas with you. But I want you first and foremost to work together to kind of reach some kind of a consensus or to share your ideas. And so I'm going to stop the share for a moment, and I'm going to put you guys in groups, and we'll take some time to sort of unravel this question. Now, as a reminder, I do want you to consider the reading. but I also want to just hear from you, and I want to understand what your understanding is, and what your experience and your knowledge is, and what insights you have. So let's go ahead and create the rooms. We have, let's create 10 rooms of 4 to 5 people, okay? I'll create those right now. I'm gonna open those up, and I'm gonna share the screen again so that you have the question. And I want you to work together to try to get to the bottom of this. So we'll start now. We'll take about 5 or 10 minutes, and I may be coming around to check with you to see how things are going. Thank you for clarifying those questions, Aditya and Sandy. I'll make a comment about that later on in the class, okay? We'll be doing it during the course time when we normally meet. And the way it'll work is you'll have access to the exam through CAT courses. You can use all your materials just as you would in class, and maybe even better than you would in class. But I'll say more about that, okay? But for now, focus on this discussion. Hey, everybody. Have you been discussing the question about whether the US was a force for good?
Yes. Some of us are talking in the group chat.
Okay, okay. So, do you have a consensus, or do you feel as though there's some conclusion that you reached as a group? Okay, okay. It was bad overall. So keep in mind, everyone, that you're muted. So if you're trying to speak, I can't hear you. But um, have you been discussing this?
Yes, but we're gonna ask you about the second question because we weren't able to write it down.
Okay, okay. The second question was the US a force for good in Latin America? So did they have a positive impact or did they have a negative impact?
So like Eddie was saying how like it's bad, but it was good for them because it was just for their success, not for the Latin country. It was just for them. They're doing things for themselves
Okay, so what was their main priority?
to get new resources for them and expand
Third, what kinds of resources?
economics.
Okay. Okay, so certainly access and obtain control of natural resources, markets, market share. Wherever there were natural resources in Latin America, there was money to be made. And so the United States saw that and saw dollar signs. And so it was useful for them to promote whatever it was they promote in Latin America if it could get them closer to some of those resources. So think about that. Territory and a lot of agriculture, says Eddie. Absolutely. So this is something that is nuanced, and we'll see that the story is complicated here shortly. But in general, you're right, and I would like to hear you discuss that a little bit more. I'm going to leave the room, but if you all want to make a comment when we get back together as a class, that would be great. Thanks, guys.
Place to export to. So they were able to, you know, US got involved in the Cuban sugar market. Latin America had another place to send their goods. And then it sort of allowed for free trade globally, which allowed most countries to profit.
Hey, everybody, I just wanted to come around and see how everything was going. It sounds like you've got a good discussion here. Um, I'm not the policeman, but this sounds excellent. And so I'm going to go ahead and I think leave the group. I'd love to hear from you all when we get back together as a class. But it sounds good, and I'm going to head over to another room. So thanks for letting me be a fly on the wall here for a moment.
Hey, Professor.
Hey, Joel. So I was just curious, did your group reach any sort of a consensus, or do you have any ideas about this question about the U.S. and whether it was a force for good, about what the main priority was? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so in the beginning of our discussion, I was talking about Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick policy, I think. That's what I remember. The Europeans were doing the crazy stuff in Africa and their imperialism, and then the US pretty much told them to stay away from Latin America, and we did this around the same exploitive tactics, I guess. That's what I remember.
Yeah, and that's on point. You know, the U.S. and Roosevelt in particular had this like very possessive attitude, like this kind of like jealous boyfriend attitude about Latin America, and they viewed Europe as a threat. And that was because Latin America represented a very large market for U.S. goods, but also a place that could be plundered in the name of U.S. business interests, right? So extracting natural resources, exporting agricultural products that were produced by U.S. interests, like you know, any banana company that might ring a bell. So you're pretty much right on. And this question of the U.S. influence in Latin America is very much tied up with these economic interests. And we'll see how the process was very uncomfortable in that the United States was so over the top early on in trying to control Latin America. But it's a complicated story, and there's more to it than maybe meets the eye as well. So we'll have a discussion in class, and we look forward to maybe hearing from you all if you want to add something. But I just wanted to come around and see how everything's going. And it sounds like you've discussed this. I think that what we'll do is we'll close the rooms and we'll get back together and we'll hear from some other groups. So thanks for letting me join you, and I'll see you in a moment.
All right, thank you.
All right, everybody, I'm going to close the rooms and we're going to repopulate the classroom. And please join us as we get back together and as I share the screen again. Salute. So everyone, as we get back together, I think that we can begin to discuss this sort of as a class. And I think the key question for us is, was the US a force for good in Latin America? And how does that tie into maybe what their main priority was and what they were up to at this time? What is your understanding, or what is your impression? What can we say to this question? Is there anyone who'd like to take the floor and make a comment?
Can I?
Absolutely.
Okay, one of the things that like I really thought was really important and a key term within the whole aspect of the reading was that the U.S. was like taking predatory loans and lending them out to like other countries like in Latin America that knew that they couldn't pay, so they could control some aspects. Like in the case of Nicaragua, they controlled their customs after they loaned them $15 million.
It's a really good example, Juan.
And that's one of the things that's happening in like today's society as well. Like the thing with TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the government, just Trump, just in general, just wants the money to be here in the U.S. as opposed to abroad. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing some of the parallels that you see between then and now. It seems like not much has actually changed, huh?
None.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you gave the example about loans and how those loans were made contingent upon like obtaining control of certain assets or like certain types of economic institutions and stuff. That's really important because we know that those Latin American countries depended a lot on foreign countries for finance because they were so poor internally. And what they couldn't finance with export taxes, they had to finance with foreign loans. And what that often meant in turn was that they had to give up some control of their sovereignty. And so Nicaragua is one example, but there are many others. And Nicaragua is one that we'll discuss here in a second. John says, if we don't learn from history, we will suffer from it. I agree. Oh, Aditya, 80 and Deleonore's group, the main goal was economic and political expansion. The United States wanted to have a I scratch your back and you scratch mine with any country that could benefit them more than it benefits the other country. This includes the possible expansion of Christianity, the use of land to grow produce and grow each other's economy. Absolutely. There was this idea that the US promoted that Latin American countries depended or should depend more on the US than maybe European countries. And we'll see here in a moment that the US had a very possessive, kind of jealous attitude about Latin America, like, oh, it's our backyard, Europe, stay at bay. And so this is so key to keep in mind as we go forward. I heard from some groups who I met with and spoke to as I joined their rooms. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or take the floor and add something to this discussion?
So
Yeah.
also, oh, you go
Oh,
first.
No,
Ishan.
go.
No, after you.
No, John, we haven't heard from you, I think, yet, because I just spoke to Ishan's group a moment ago. But John, do you want to say something?
Oh, I was about to say that during the time you already spoke earlier about how they were fighting, well, not fighting, but going against the European for influence over in Latin America. Not only were they going against them in terms of politics, but they were also going in terms of ideologies so that they can actually have a more stake into Latin America. Because at the time they were also trying to spread their influence, and with World War I and II going on, they also wanted to spread democracy with their institution in mind and not the Europeans.
Good. Yes. So this conflict between the United States and Europe, it was really over Latin America, and it's kind of like, fighting over like an asset, right? They viewed it that way, and not because Latin America was an asset, but it was viewed as a land of plenty that could be taken advantage of and turned to U.S. ends or European ends for that matter. And so the United States wasn't really any better than Europe in this regard because they were fighting over control of Latin America and not necessarily the promotion of some destiny that would be beneficial in the first place for Latin Americans. And so the United States kind of comes into the picture in a kind of complicated way, and in a way that is nuanced, but that is in the first place quite exploitative. And the U.S. takes as its priority establishing some control and claiming some ownership over the region. And this is what gets us into the international component. And the international component is, well, actually, you know what, Ishan, do you want to make a comment? I was going to let you say something, and then I moved on. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of further the point that John was talking about not just the importance of the money influence, but also the political influence. As we see today, the most Latin American countries have a similar setup of their presidential systems to the way that the US was set up. And also the promotion of democracy was key to some of their interventions in countries such as the Dominican Republic, where they set up a democracy, and then Nicaragua, when they didn't like what their democracy did, so they US-ified the democracy to put the guy that they wanted in charge. So I think it's important to note the role that political power played as well as economic.
Yes. And those politics often were set up to serve the economics, and the economics helped to solidify the politics. And so those relationships are intricate, but there clearly is a role for interests, but also democratic institutions for the purpose of the United States, or for maybe not necessarily Latin America, but maybe democracy was viewed as gospel because it would be advantageous to the United States. And this is the thing that we'll see over and over in Latin America. It's complicated. When we say democracy, we might not understand it the same way as we might in the United States, where we think of democracy as really being about enfranchising all. It's complicated, and the democracy promotion served to promote the economics and vice versa. Are there others we can hear from before we move on? I want to hear from as many people as possible. And this is a discussion that has many angles, and I know that there were a lot of ideas that came up in the groups.
I was saying back when I was in my group discussion that, because one of the questions was, like if they were interested for the good or the bad of it. I was saying that their interest is more of like a one-sided interest, because
as the the name or Mexico at the time or whatever the correct term is. I apologize. Um, they knew that it was a country that was low and like resources that they had, so they would use it as like a, well, if you allow us to input factories or input, I guess, like for their own personal gains, we'll pay for the most part, and then we'll hire your workers. But they just want like for example, if it was oil, they would hire workers and pay them like a lower than a minimum wage, or it's like something that is just like is well on their side, but really poor considered, like like bare minimum type of thing. And they would just hire them, and then they would take 80% of it and then offer them like, oh, we'll give you 10%, and then we can sell the remaining 10% together. But they would still take commission off of that. So it was more of like a one-sided interest just to further their own benefits. That's how I was saying it, and what my group and I were discussing.
Yeah, and that sounds consistent with what we saw in the reading, but also in this discussion. And as we know, the United States is primarily interested in its own interests, right? And as a powerful nation at the time, it could do that, and especially in its conflict with Europe. Are there any other groups who'd like to make a comment? We've heard from a number of folks, but I'm sure that there may be some more.
There was something of a parallel that I just wanted to make or point out within like history, if that's possible, or just briefly. It was more so within like the I guess something that John previously mentioned was like the fact that like it was a one-sided relationship for a lot of these negotiations and a lot of these deals where people would be what's the word? Well, inequality in a big sense, and I feel like that's still it's still pretty evident within internal social issues now. So too, like a lot of the things that we see with like a lot of undocumented people or individuals working for field workers or working in the fields for very little pay, and at the end of the day, like a lot of that money, a lot of that big income, and a lot of the farmers who happen to own them, like they don't give them the necessary or even the bare minimum that is necessary for them to survive, or that is dignified for them. And that's something that I kind of connected back to when you were discussing liberal like market in sense, and also like more of a perhaps like what's the word when it's a continuous it's like history repeats itself. I can't remember what it's called.
Like a
but
cycle.
yeah, a cycle, I guess, is what I'm going. Yeah, something like it, but not just in externally, but also internally. And that's something that's very evident within, like, perhaps even within, like, embedded within American culture, so
Yeah.
much so.
Yeah, in some ways, those inequalities get reproduced within America
Okay.
when Latin Americans come to the United States for whatever reason. And that's a really good point, Orlando. I think that there is a parallel, and you see a lot of those inequalities reproduced over time. And the way in which the United States cornered Latin American countries for debt repayment was especially like emblematic of this. For example, still today, Argentina is hounded by international creditors, most of which come from the United States. And the US government represents those creditors in the name of getting that repayment, to the point of crippling Argentina and sending them into deep debt just to pay down the existing debt. And they don't permit any reduction in the overall interest owed. They're merciless in their demand for total repayment. In the United States, like Europe, was very much focused on debt repayment at this time too. And so there are some parallels that are inescapable, in addition to those dynamics that get reproduced within society that Orlando mentioned. It's really quite striking how consistent the story today can be when you look at some of the patterns back then. Marcella says, we, the US, get involved because we know we were going to benefit from it and not to help people. The government then justified its action by stating it was done for the good of all Americans. Yeah, and for the good of Latin Americans too, right? Marcella, the democracy promotion, for example, was sort of pitched as good for Latin America. But we know that democracy promotion meant putting in place a certain set of institutions that would be beneficial to the United States. And often that meant supporting powerful executives or kind of holding back parties that might seek to enfranchise indigenous or women or groups who could undercut the interests of landowners in business interests that are linked to the United States. And so it's, again, that question of democracy for who, right? Democracy for who? This is the key question. And this is the question that goes hand in hand with the US relationship with Latin America. And so this is all on point. And I'm so happy that you have all these ideas, everyone. is there anyone else we can hear from before we continue? I think there's more to say here.
I think if it's okay, I think it's a funny relationship that the Latin America has with America, because for example in Mexico, the U.S. exploits it all the time with everything, well, almost everything, and they still just love this country so much. They're like nationally, like we're taking away their water, and they still are like, oh, like that's our neighbors, and they send people over whenever we have fires so that they can help with the fires in California, because they know that we don't have enough firefighters. They always send us money whenever, like they send us money whenever we have hurricanes, and they send people to go help over there in Texas recently. And it's so disgusting the way that the US treats its allies, because they're so loyal to it, to a fault. And like each one of those countries would die just to be its best, the US's like best ally, I guess, or like at least for better treatment. And the US continues to just treat them like horribly. And like unfortunately it does exploit Mexico to a huge extent, and then to other smaller countries, like, but that's just like Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, like the Panama Canal, like we're not talking about that, but that was a disgusting thing that the US did, because they knew what they were doing and how important it was going to be.
Certainly.
But yeah.
Yeah, Samantha, that's exactly right. And I see these patterns show up in the reading and show up in our discussion, and examples like Puerto Rico, which we'll discuss here momentarily, places like Guam, which were seized from Spain. These transfers and these acquisitions, if you will, they did not necessarily or at all benefit these places. They benefited the United States. And so really, we talked about the end of the colonial period, but in some ways, the imperialistic tendencies were reproduced and were promoted by the United States itself after the withdrawal of Spain. And so it's kind of like, well, colonialism by another name or some other form. And that might be a little strong for some, but in a moment we'll discuss the way that the United States approached Latin America and what kinds of interests were at stake and why they behaved the way that they did. There's a lot of agreement among various people in class about how the United States related to Latin America and what the various interests involved were. And this is a very good discussion. I'm very happy to see where we are with this. I'm going to pick up where we've kind of left off here, and I'm going to continue to discuss this question of the US and Latin America. Now, the US, throughout the 19th century, the 1800s, had a bit of a strange relationship with Latin America. It was a little bit standoffish. It's true that in 1923, the Monroe Doctrine was issued as a warning to European countries not to interfere in Latin America, but it was really mostly symbolic, because Great Britain was already worried that France would take the place of Spain after Spain's withdrawal. And so Great Britain had actually promoted the idea of a Monroe Doctrine and more control and more influence for the United States. Interestingly, France and England had already agreed under what was called the POLI memorandum that neither would actually fill the void left by Spain. And so the United States, while they promoted the Monroe Doctrine, during the 1800s, didn't actually face a kind of palpable threat in the form of maybe a European country who would stand in for Spain. But European powers did intervene in Latin America at the time. And what we see is that they largely behaved in a way that was consistent with the behavior of the United States. And so, for example, Great Britain was very interested in Nicaragua in the 1850s because it represented a potential transoceanic route that could connect markets in Europe in the New World. And so they put troops in Nicaragua during the 1850s. Spain occupied the Chincha Islands in Peru and shelled Chilean cities for about 2 years in the 1860s to back reparation claims tied to independence. And they were interested in getting back money and resources that they assumed and they viewed as tied to the independence wars and that had been incurred by Spain. Now, that was their perspective, but they were the loser, and so naturally they claimed the need for reparations. They never got them, but this gives you a sense of the way that some European powers behaved. Cinco de Mayo in Mexico celebrates the Battle of Puebla, which was actually when Mexico stopped French troops who were landing to back debt payments. You'll see a pattern here over and over, which is that European powers had fronted Latin American countries credit and money when those Latin American countries had to build their states. And in the wake of that fronting and the acquisition of that credit by Latin American countries, European countries would go knocking on the door and say, well, now you must pay back that debt. You must pay that back with interest, to the point of landing troops in various places, Nicaragua and elsewhere, in the name of those debt repayments. And it's really interesting, for example, that in the 1860s, this is something I didn't know until recently, France actually invaded Mexico over debt repayment. And they installed an Austrian archduke named Maximilian I as the Emperor of Mexico. And he was in power for 3 years before he was eventually killed by Mexicans. And it was interesting. They gave him a chance to escape if he agreed to cut his beard, but he didn't agree to, and they killed him. So this was all over debt repayment. His installation in the first place was driven by this perception of France that there was a need to exert control over Mexico to get them to pay back that money. That's why France installed a king in Mexico. It's a little piece of history that's interesting that maybe we don't know. But the United States was involved during this period as well. They annexed half of Mexico's territory after the US-Mexican War. This was an enormous change of hands of property that left Mexico with far, far less, and it significantly expanded the size of the American state. But apart from all of this, the US influence in the region was actually limited, and it was somewhat kind of symbolic. And the conflicts during the period between European powers and over Latin American assets and resources took the form primarily of conflicts over debt repayment, that debt having been accrued by Latin American countries during this period as part of their effort to build their states and build their militaries. The situation really began to change in 1898, and this was the Spanish-American War. This was the turning point. The United States seized Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines and Guam from Spain, and this marked the rise of the United States as a global power. This was the moment when the United States not only seized control, but began to identify Latin America as truly consequential and important to their interests. But what interests? This is the question that I put to you a moment ago. And the interests were primarily economic interests. They were interested in access and control of large markets for US goods, but they were also interested in establishing and exerting control by American economic interests who had business interests in Latin America, in natural resources, in agricultural products. It was so consequential and so important for the United States to establish these relationships and to open up these markets and to exert control over Latin America that they went to war and seized these territories in the name of doing so. And this was the beginning of really the period that we associate with the most intense US-Latin American relations, in the period that saw a variety of different incursions by the United States, interventions motivated primarily by the perception of economic interest. So I'm taking a look at the comments here. There are so many comments. I'm going to read some of these because it sounds like there's some interesting commentary. To me, it sounds like they want the land, but not the people. I think so, Sandy. Carmina says, exactly, Juan, there is zero justification. The white and wealthy in America love to deny that disenfranchisement doesn't still exist. Diego says, can you blame him? That's an awesome beard. I do agree. It was a pretty awesome beard. Who could do without that? Maybe especially me. I'm not able to do without that. I'm growing out my COVID beard. Quinn says, ooh. Aditya says, LOL. Wow. Not worth dying for. La Bataille de Puebla. Ishan says, can you imagine how much time it took for him to grow it? Mini COVIDs. That might be his life's work right there. Quinn says, but to die for it? Aditya says, he is a Viking. Life or cut. So a lot of funny commentary in here. You guys have a great sense of humor. I wish that we could be in the classroom together. Um, okay, so there's a lot here. Good stuff. Good stuff. So here we are. We're at the pinnacle of U.S. involvement in Latin America that really took its force through the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of these new possessions. And it wasn't just that the United States wanted control of Latin America. It was also the case that the United States was angered by European powers who exerted their own influence in the region. And so, for instance, Britain blockaded Venezuela to collect debts in 1902, 1903. President Roosevelt was okay with using force to collect, but he was not okay with Europe. And so this gave force and rise to what was called the Roosevelt Corollary, which is depicted here and shows the kinds of relationships involved with that corollary. Basically, this made the US the regional policeman. It gave the US the capacity to enforce debt payments on behalf of the Europeans. And so they would collect on behalf of Europe, but they would not let Europe be the ones to collect. And so what this meant was it was a political move. This was a move intended to solidify the US's control over debt repayment and over the economic relationships that had been initiated between European and Latin American countries during the period of state building in the post-colonial period. This was a period where the United States begins to really exert its control politically. And again, I want to emphasize the nexus between economics and politics. This is the US exerting political control over economic relationships that had been initiated through that period of state building. And the cartoon here is really excellent because it helps to show, Roosevelt on the one hand representing the US with its firepower, in going after those European powers who themselves had particular claims and claims in those places where the United States had begun to extend its influence politically. And so these various Latin American countries that owed money to Europe, but who were essentially under the control of the United States, at least to the extent that the US controlled their debt repayment and had significant power over them in the form of being kind of the policeman in the region. We've got these emerging Latin American republics, largely under the control of the powerful northern giant in the form of the United States. And these relations really turned economic when the United States began to promote its own interests in the region. And it wasn't just that they wanted to control politically the interests or the activities and the economics in Latin America, they also had their own interests. And this took the form of what we call dollar diplomacy. This was a policy that put foreign policy and military forces at the behest of US business interests. What kinds of interests? Well, any interest or any business involved in producing agricultural products, fruits, vegetables, meat, anything that is produced on a farm, but also natural resources like copper and silver and gold, anything that you can possibly think of that Latin American countries may have produced, Latin American countries saw significant investment on the part of US business interests who themselves wanted to exploit those resources and gain control of those markets and gain control of the profits from those resources. And Latin American countries were very, very weak in comparison. US forces dwarfed those in Latin America. They were much, much larger, the military, and there was real money to be made. There was real money to be made in the name of extracting natural resources, in the name of exerting control over agricultural production, and so on and so forth. And so this is where what began as a political relationship becomes more economic. And what we see is the subordination of all policy interests to the interests of the business class and business interests in the US. And I cannot emphasize this enough. There are whole books written about this. For instance, there's this book, Open Veins of Latin America, and it's about how US interests, but also colonial interests, were so deeply involved in exerting control over profit making and economic activity and taking control of assets in Latin America and really serving themselves at the expense of Latin American countries. There was real money to be made, and the US military was enormous, and Latin American forces could not contend with that influence. And so, just like you might expect, what began to happen was the extension of this control through dollar diplomacy and the kind of solidification of US control in the region. And again, Roosevelt is the one who's so associated with this for the reasons that we've discussed: his impatience with Europe, and his alignment with U.S. interests in the strength of those interests. And the question, what kind of money was to be made in Latin America? Again, I'm talking about natural resources, gold and silver and copper, agricultural products, the various things that pre-industrial economies made and that they depended on as exports and how they made most of their money. U.S. business interests wanted to attain control of those interests and benefit themselves. And so you saw a lot of investment from the U.S. into Latin American countries, but again, principally to serve U.S. interests and to channel money and revenues back and profits back to the United States away from Latin America. And what was it that justified intervention in these places? It was economic interest in the interests of business classes. But again, I want to emphasize that though economic interests motivated these decisions in these actions, it required political power to bring these things about. The US military was enormous by comparison to Latin American militaries. No Latin American country could contend with that influence. Once the United States made it a priority to obtain control of assets in Latin America, that was the end as far as the fate of Latin American economies was concerned. And this is the period that begins to kind of sow the seeds of Latin American subordination to U.S. control and U.S. influence. And it's through this set of interventions that we'll now begin to discuss that Latin American countries kind of fell to the United States in ways that would become so consequential even a century later in the form of U.S.-backed coups, in the continual preservation through politics and political changes engineered by the United States of those interests that were so beneficial to U.S. business interests and business classes, and that the U.S. government really depended upon the support of. So before we continue, I'm going to take a look at the chat here. Would U.S. get some sort of cut for collecting the debt? I don't know the details, Leonardo, but I think probably, right? There were probably arrangements that were made. I think that the most important point here, though, was that politically it was an extension of control by the U.S., right? It was them saying politically, we control these relationships. If you collect debt at all, it will be through us, working with Latin America. The Banana War, John, is a good example. And there are a lot of different conflicts that seem to bring into focus these interests and the collision in the political power and how political power became an important component. Let's take a look at a couple different cases of dollar diplomacy that will help us to illustrate this set of relationships. One of the most important cases is the case of Nicaragua. Now, would you believe it that between 1909 and 1933, US troops marched in Nicaragua every single year but 1911? They were a constant presence in what was supposed to be an electoral democracy, as we just discussed a moment ago. Now, who did they support within this democracy? Naturally, they supported the Conservative Party, who represented business interests in those traditional landed elites and those interests that would often be linked with the United States. And they were so supportive of this corrupt Conservative Party in Nicaragua that they helped to give rise to a guerrilla insurgency led by a man named Cesar Augusto Sandino, who would be the namesake of an anti-imperialist movement that would form about a century later, not a century later, about 50 years later, called the Sandinista movement. Now, support for the conservatives meant battling the guerrillas. And that meant that the United States would have to get involved at a very, very primitive level in Nicaragua, challenging and confronting these forces that had arrayed against them in the name of preserving Nicaraguan sovereignty and kind of sort of making the United States get out. The case of Nicaragua is important precisely because it shows the cost of dollar diplomacy. And I'll tell you what I mean. Now, the US Marines probably thought that they would make quick work of Nicaragua, but they actually lost 130 men, and they brought attacks on US interests in retaliation. The Sandinistas, the movement led by Sandino, would lead these attacks on US business interests in retaliation for the US presence. And over time, the intervention in the face of this retaliation became a total embarrassment. And it became an absolute pall over the moral authority of the US. And it made it impossible, for example, for the US to argue that China couldn't meddle in, that Japan couldn't meddle in China. That's one example. They lost their moral authority precisely because of their own intervention and meddling in Nicaragua. And so this was very consequential for the United States because it wasn't worth it. This showed the costliness of this policy of dollar diplomacy, but it also showed the influence of US business interests who could basically appropriate state power in the name of these US Marines going to bat for them in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is one example. Cuba is another example. Cuba is an important case because it shows some of the ethical dilemmas involved in dollar diplomacy. So the US imposed the Platt Amendment on Cuba in 1903. And this was an amendment that allowed US intervention for the preservation of Cuban independence, for the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. And so on the surface, the Platt Amendment was supposed to be designed to promote democracy. The idea was, well, this will be something that we can use to promote a system that we think is best for our interests, and we'll have to promote democracy as a part of this. This justified a number of interventions, and those took place between 1906 and 1909, 1912, and then between 1917 and 1922. But the system began to get more complicated. The Platt Amendment began to get more complicated in the years that followed, precisely because of some of the dilemmas faced by the United States resulting from their supposed commitment to democracy. So in the 1920s, Cuba saw the rise of a dictator named Gerardo Machado. And he was a vicious, repressive man. He increased repression and he used the state to violate constitutional guarantees. And he helped to bring about an authoritarian regime in Cuba. But he did bring stability in protected foreign investors, those foreign investors primarily coming from the United States. Now, this was a test. Would the US adhere to the Platt Amendment? If they were to adhere to the Platt Amendment, they would take out Machado, or they would do what they could to promote democracy and kind of sideline those authoritarian impulses that were coming out in his government. But if they weren't actually interested in promoting democracy, they would probably prop up Machado and kind of look the other way. What did they do? Well, what they would do would help to actually highlight what the true interest and motivation of the United States at the time in Latin America was. And what they did is they did not uphold the Platt Amendment. Instead, they strained to remain true to it by holding that the Platt Amendment only applied to foreigners and not Cubans. How convenient, right? Convenient, because that meant that they could excuse the repression and the impulses of the Machado regime, and they could use that sort of fig leaf, if you will, to continue to prop up a regime that was ultimately beneficial for foreign investors and US interests. And this, more so than the Nicaraguan case, showed the ethical dilemmas associated with dollar diplomacy. And it showed that there was a conflict of interests. And it showed that, in fact, democracy was not the main objective. Had democracy been the main objective, Machado wouldn't have stayed in power, and there would have been a very different course of action for the United States. Now, Cuba and Nicaragua are just two cases, but they help to highlight some of the extremes and some of the choices and some of the interests and some of the conflicts involved in US Latin American relations during this period. And it helps you to see how enmeshed political and economic interests become, and how political power helps to serve economic interests, and how economic interests help to solidify political power. And the question that I'll put to you that I can't let you answer because we're running out of time is, was the US promoting democracy or imperialism? And what they were promoting is, really the key question. And I think that you can argue either of these, but you've got to take a position and make a clear case. And we don't have any more time, but before we wrap up, let me take a look at the chat. Okay, so it looks like everything that we've said in the chat is relevant, and we've kind of brought that to an end. We're out of time, unfortunately, and so you're free to go if you've got somewhere to go. But otherwise, I'm going to stick around and take comments or questions. I'm going to stop recording this right now. I'm going to send you an email tomorrow. I intend to send it tomorrow with the study guide and with some more information about the exam as promised. But you are free to go now.